This has nothing to do with safety, nothing to do with law and order. We've got the federal government that is violating their written agreements with these jurisdictions, both state and local, in order to come in the first place, and is failing to notify, which creates incredible risk for the officers.
Today on The Color Between the Lines, I'm joined by Dr. Phillip Atiba Solomon, professor of psychology and Black studies at Yale University and co-founder of the Center for Policing Equity. Dr. Solomon has spent years studying how racial bias and policing intersect, and he now is sounding the alarm about what he calls a dangerous step toward authoritarianism, the growing militarization of America's police and cities. The administration, their goal appears to be deploying federal agents and National Guardsmen in order to restore order and protect communities. But why do you believe that, and others believe, that this approach could be dangerous?
Yeah, so I have to push back on the framing of the question. I don't believe for a second that this administration is trying to restore order. I don't believe that this administration has a good faith belief that there isn't order in Baltimore or DC or LA or Portland or Chicago. I believe that this administration would like to create visual displays of law enforcement being replaced by the military in places that are not where he gets a lot of votes.
Mm, mm,
When you normalize seeing the military going in, it starts to feel like, well, maybe the military should go in, right? Maybe it's reasonable to have the military go in. And that allows for the sort of public safety function that police play to be usurped by the federal government. And so instead of having 18,000 law enforcement agencies that are at least supposed to be responsive to local communities, you have one law enforcement agency which is consolidated under an authoritarian aspiring president.
mm.
And I believe, as Governor Pritzker just said yesterday, that the entirety, like these folks are not particularly sophisticated, right? They're not particularly complex. So the entire rationale of this is when you normalize it, then when there's a crisis that you need to produce, for instance, around an election, then you can go ahead and send your own personal army to affect the change that you need around that crisis that you have produced. So each of these are test runs to say, how big and how scary can we make these places that are other to the folks who support me, who I need to maintain my political power, right? So this has nothing to do with safety, nothing to do with law and order. We've got the federal government that is violating their written agreements with these jurisdictions, both state and local, in order to come in the first place, and is failing to notify, which creates incredible risk for the officers, not just the local law enforcement, but for the federal officers. Enormous risk, right? As well as shame and embarrassment on the part of law enforcement on all sides. But the goal is the consolidation of political power. And until we name that as such, and that name it as that's what we're watching, then we're going to engage in these silly distraction debates of like, well, maybe we should all celebrate if sending the military brings crime down. We shouldn't. It won't. And that's not the issue in the first place.
Well, and I understand your argument, and I think it really makes sense. But it feels like, and this is from my perspective of seeing reports of other people interviewing locals on the ground, talking about local crime and how it's gotten out of control. And what do you say to those people who feel like this might be a reasonable response?
Yeah, so I am really sensitive to the idea that my experience of crime and disorder is untethered to the reality of it, right? If you've ever been at a party and you see somebody getting just a little bit extra tipsy, makes you feel like the whole party's drunk, right? No, it's just that one woman over there, right, who don't like her life decisions, right? But all of a sudden it feels like the whole party's drunk and like, am I unusually sober? Do I need to figure out what to do? Do I need to drink more or leave the party? We have seen so many images of a lawless American city over the last several months. It can definitely feel that way. And it is the natural tendency of both local and national media, right? They say if it bleeds, it leads, to lead with sensationalized stories of crime. By the way, particularly if they're perpetrated by black or brown people, black and brown men in particular. So Travis Dixon, the brilliant communications scientist at University of Illinois, has said for years that the representation on local media does not look like the actual representations of people committing crimes. So for folks who are saying, oh, it's out of control, do they know that we've seen a record dip in violent crime in each one of these cities in the course of the last couple of years? Probably not. And I don't know that it's reasonable to expect that the whole of the population should be up to date on our crime stats. But just because you feel some type of way doesn't mean it is that type of way. And we should have policy that's tethered to reality and not individuals' feelings.
Which makes sense. I want to ask about how do we balance between maintaining order and preserving civil liberties? What would be your approach in how to answer that question?
Yeah. I think I'm so glad for the framings of these questions because it gets me to be able to talk about the way we frame these questions historically. We think about it as, well, we might have to have some intrusions into our liberties in order to keep ourselves safe. And in fact, the whole idea of the reason why we live together as a society is that if we're just by ourselves, stuff gets rough out there in the state of nature, right? Like big people beat up little people, and it's just not fair. But it turns out that once you've decided to live together, our civil liberties and our safety are the same. I don't mean that in some kind of radical leftist crazy notion, right? Or radical right crazy notion. I mean that in terms as a scientist. When people believe that they will be respected and that law enforcement or whoever is going to show up in response to a crisis is going to respond appropriately, proportionally, and with the interest of the full community, they're more likely to report that something was done that broke a rule. When people don't believe that's going to happen, right? So I don't believe that whoever's going to show up is going to respect me, is going to treat the community respectfully. Guess what they don't do? The reason why we have a culture of no snitching, not just in incarcerated facilities, but in Black and brown communities. The reason why anybody teaches their kids that is because when you report to the authorities, we're going to have a worse outcome, which is why the murder clearance rate, that means the ability to hold an individual accountable for taking someone's life, is below 50% in a large number of our vulnerable communities. How is that possible? People know who did it. It's not confusing, but they're not willing to talk about it because the cure is worse than the disease. So when we think about safety as opposed to liberty or how do we balance it, it's a false dichotomy. The way you get safer communities is you have a more trustworthy set of systems, because only then do you get cooperation with them. And as it turns out, law enforcement cannot do anything like a job we'd be happy with if they don't have the consent of the governed. And right now, in too many of the most vulnerable communities, they don't. The problem is not the people who live there. The problem is the systems that afflict them.
So, what, in your opinion, would be some of those tweaks to the system that would be answers to some of the concerns of those who are questioning whether we should have this kind of policing in the first place?
Yeah. So I want to be clear that part of what we're going through right now is a world where the narratives that we're given are untethered to the communities where this stuff is happening. All right. So when people say, well, you don't care about victims of crime, I'm like, oh, really? That's a great thing to bring up, right? Not that I don't care, but what do the victims and survivors of violent crime, what do they want? What would happen if our policies were set up actually around the people who are most afflicted by violence? Well, it turns out by at least a 10-to-1 margin, they would prefer investment in job training to further investment in police and incarceration facilities. And by a 15-to-1 margin, they would want investment in educational facilities to more policing and more incarceration facilities. So now who doesn't care about the victims of crime? Is it me who knows that and talks to those folks and does those surveys? By the way, that's a survey originally done by the Alliance for Safety and Justice that came out with that. So if you want to go fact check me, go ahead and take a look at that. Also support their work. Right? Is it me who knows that and communicates with folks who live in those communities? Or is it the folks who want to use the specter of crime for their own political gain, who want to play tough guy rather than create strong communities? I make the argument that if you really care about safety, you should talk to the people who feel least safe. And those folks know it's their neighbors who are most likely both to victimize them and to be victimized. They understand there isn't a simple solution where it's deserving people and undeserving people. It's communities that don't have enough and people making bad choices when all they have is terrible options. When you start to reframe the question that way, the solutions are fairly straightforward. And by the way, we have very recent, very strong evidence that there are solutions that don't require that we make demons of our neighbors.
If this conversation with Dr. Phillip Atiba Solomon is resonating with you, please subscribe to the Color Between the Lines podcast or the YouTube channel. They're both free, but your subscription helps amplify voices doing the hard work of truth telling and helps keep me bringing stories to you that challenge, inform, and inspire action.
What's happening in Birmingham, what's happening in Baltimore, with the support also of Wes Moore as governor, right? These are historic reductions in violent crime, not by reinvesting in greater mechanisms of punishment, but by creating the conditions where there's not a crisis in the first place. If I've got access to mental health resources, if I've got access to substance disorder treatments, if I've got access to a job and security in where I live, it turns out I would rather not risk putting myself or my family at risk by engaging in violent crime. It's not hard to see that people would never choose that if their options included something that was better. So it's a longer term solve, and I'm not suggesting we don't need enforcement in the moment, but we've had these reductions in crime in the course of a year, 2 years, and they're 50% reductions in violent crime. There's no way we're getting a 50% reduction in violent crime by sending in the military. It's not going to happen.
I'm wondering if, because you have studied this issue through a historical lens. And are there moments perhaps in American history where you can point to where there were similar expansions of power that produced unintended consequences?
Yeah, so I can tell you that the data in the United States on crime and police behavior, they are terrible. They are some of the worst data that I have ever encountered as a data scientist. So it's really difficult to go historically and say, well, here's where we've seen something like this, and here were the consequences. And there hasn't been the same kind of expansion of federal force into local jurisdictions at this scale in US history. But I can tell you that when they did things like this in Italy, when they do things like this in Russia and in other places where we've seen rises of authoritarianism, what we see is a reduction in the feeling that people can express themselves freely, a reduction in trust towards the government and towards law enforcement, and a rise in unreported crime, right? What that means is the most vulnerable folks, and I do mean in this case kids, women, folks with disabilities, folks who are deeply impoverished, are the most vulnerable to increases in violence with no one calling to report it. In the same way that if you are unhoused, you are really much more likely to experience violence because who calls on behalf of folks who are without homes, right? If no one trusts the government and no one wants to be close to the government because the government can arrest you just for being in your presence, right? Well, then the folks who are most vulnerable, who have the least to lose, are the folks who are going to be most vulnerable to excess violence from each other. It creates the perfect conditions for greater violence, which is greater justification to say, see those folks committing violence, they are bad people, they deserve these terrible outcomes, that's why we had to be there in the first place. It's a vicious narrative cycle. That's why in all of your questions, what I'm trying to do is to say, no, resist the narrative cycle. I'm not saying that, I'm not making an argument about whether or not we need police. Okay. That is an argument that we should have, but that's not the argument I'm saying, right? I'm not making the argument we don't need enforcement right now. That's not the conversation we're having. What I am saying is if you think that the issue is just enforcement, think about yourself as a teenager, right? All the dumb things you did or nearly did or that your friends did. Was there any kind of punishment you could have been vaguely aware of that would have prevented that? In the moment, if they'd reminded you maybe, but there is nobody who's homeless because they didn't feel like there was enough of a punishment for them. There's nobody who's doing this because there's insufficient punishment. They're doing it because they're already in crisis and they couldn't contain their crisis to their own life, so the crisis spilled out on ours. We like to say that the public safety system is what's necessary or what responds when our public health and our public care systems have already failed people, right? When that is our understanding of what crime stats look like, then this overreach by the federal government is clearly not about safety. It can't be about safety. It's just about political power.
The response by many people is to go out and protest, but then there's this large response by those who are in authority to crack down on all the protesters. So, what, in your opinion, would make the difference for those who feel like they're just being silenced and they don't want to comply beforehand? They want to show that they don't like this and they want to push back.
Yeah, so I can give a couple of things that I know my students do, some things that I do, but really at the root, there's only one answer to that question that I would want people to understand. Buckle up and strap in. This is not a short-term thing. You guys remember when you read in the history books about, what we would want to call the Second Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, right? Some folks who are listening or watching definitely went through it, lived through it, right? This is that. All those moments in history where you saw resistance against authoritarianism, where you saw resistance against violent and cruel state mistreatment of vulnerable communities, this is your chance to be part of that. And that's going to require some creativity and some aligning your values to a different set of behaviors in your life. Because unfortunately, we no longer live in a country where you can participate by going to vote once every 4 years, maybe once every 2 years, and then just have a life that's disconnected from the politics. The politics is in all of our lives all of the time. And if you think just because you don't live in Memphis or Chicago, it's not coming to a city near you, you are naive to the point of being not an adult in this moment. I'll say, if you feel like you've got the ability to show up and protest, do it. People are paying attention. Even a small protest gets cameras. Even a little bit of protest creates community. That's a good thing. But it's also okay to get involved in your municipal structures, right? A number of years ago, we had folks who thought that it was bad to learn about diversity and bad for people to love folks of the same gender, and they got really involved in school boards. And look at what that did. It changed the entire textbook industry, right? Folks who disagree with that can do that too. You can get involved on a local level, you can run for something, you can just simply support somebody. At the very least, you can get to know the folks who represent you and write them a note. Do you know that there are people in those offices whose job it is to pick up and talk to constituents? Have you ever been one of them? Figure out the way that fits for your life and then commit to doing it, right? At least one day a month, one day a week, and then you do it every day. But resistance, which is what this is, resistance to a fascistic, aspiring takeover of the systems of the United States, resistance requires persistence. So you got to get locked in on what's going to happen in your life. You can't do it like the New Year's resolution where you say you're going to work out every day, 7 hours a day, and you do that once, and then you can't do it the second day because you're too sore. Make it fit into your life, but make sure that you understand this has got to be a sustained practice for it to matter.
And what is, I guess, your final word for me during this interview? This was a very insightful interview. I don't want to leave something out that perhaps you didn't cover.
Yeah, I would say, as an extension to my answer to the last question, there are more people who care about this stuff and who are trying to do something than you might think. So I run the Center for Policing Equity. I'm also faculty at Yale. But at the center, we have new guidance coming out on how local law enforcement can choose not to cooperate with federal immigration. That's an option. Um, there are local organizations and national organizations that you can educate yourself about. And I would encourage you to use the Google machine. We are now more connected to information about the world than we've ever been. And while we've got to be vigilant to disinformation, finding out who's engaged in the stuff you might want to be engaged in is a great way to expand community and expand your power.
Many thanks to Dr. Phillip Atiba Solomon of Yale University for offering such a powerful, data-driven perspective on race, policing, and democracy. To learn more about his work, visit policingequity.org or find his latest research through Yale University's Center for Policing Equity. I'm Esther Dillard.